The morning sky over Pearl Harbor was deceptively calm, a soft blue stretching across the Hawaiian horizon. But beneath that serene veneer, a storm of fire and steel was about to erupt. December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday, with sailors polishing decks, families strolling along the shore, and officers reviewing schedules for a day of routine operations. And then, without warning, the sky darkened with the roar of Japanese warplanes. Torpedoes ripped through the water, and bombs slammed into the heart of the United States Pacific Fleet. Smoke billowed in colossal black pillars, blotting out the sun. Fire cascaded across oil-slicked waters, and the cries of men cut through the metallic din of explosions. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning fuel and metal. Towers of flame leaped from once proud ships, now helpless against the onslaught. Among the fleet, the pride of the U.S. Navy, the battleships, took the brunt of the attack. Mighty vessels that had symbolized American strength were reduced to smoldering hulks. The Japanese pilots, flying with deadly precision, believed the fleet had been broken. They had achieved what seemed impossible, crippling America's naval power in a single devastating morning. For them, the sight of battleships listing, sinking, and burning was a testament to their tactical brilliance. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary would unfold. One ship in particular, a giant of steel and fire, would challenge everything the enemy thought they knew. While others were destined for scrap or long years of repair, this battleship would not merely be restored. It would rise again, faster than anyone dared to imagine. The very idea seemed preposterous. How could a vessel, smashed and submerged, re-emerge in record time, defying not just engineering norms, but the very expectations of war? And yet, behind the scenes, a remarkable story was already taking shape. Engineers, laborers, and naval officers moved with a determination that seemed almost superhuman. Plans were drawn with meticulous care, calculations made with precision under impossible time constraints. Every bolt, every steel plate, every repair was a calculated strike against time itself. The question that would haunt observers, both friend and foe, was simple. Could a nation, reeling from one of the greatest attacks in history, bring a leviathan of the sea back from the brink of destruction, and do it in months, not years? This was more than a tale of steel and rivets. It was a story of resilience, of ingenuity, of a collective refusal to accept defeat. While smoke still curled from the harbor, the seeds of one of the most astonishing feats in naval history were already being sown. And far above the Pacific, Japanese pilots who had laughed at the spectacle of destruction would soon witness something that defied expectation: the rebirth of a battleship, a symbol of determination, power, and the unyielding human spirit. A battleship is more than steel and rivets. It is the heartbeat of a navy, the embodiment of a nation's might, and the silent guardian of oceans that define empires. For decades, these massive vessels had patrolled the Pacific, asserting American presence and projecting strength across distant waters. Each gun turret, each armored deck, and every crew member aboard represented not only military power but a nation's pride, its resolve, and its promise to protect the ideals it stood for. When the bombs fell on December 7th, it wasn't just ships that were attacked. It was a symbol of American security, confidence, and dominance. The twisted wreckage, the smoke curling from shattered decks, and the sinking silhouettes of battleships were more than a tactical loss. They were a psychological blow, a striking message that even the mightiest can falter. To many Americans, staring at the harbor, it felt as if the nation itself had been pierced, its spirit momentarily silenced. Across the Pacific, the Japanese celebrated their precision and audacity. Their pilots, flying in formations honed by years of training, saw only victory. Their eyes traced the flames that consumed floating fortresses, the chaos that swallowed disciplined ranks, and they allowed themselves a fleeting sense of triumph. In that moment, it seemed as if America's backbone had been broken, its naval supremacy shattered, and the Pacific now wide open to Japanese control. Yet the Americans who witnessed the devastation, the sailors, officers, and shipbuilders, felt something more complex than despair. Amid the twisted metal and drowned decks, there was a spark, the recognition that these battleships were not merely machines to be destroyed. They were symbols of a promise that could be rebuilt, reminders of national resolve. To rebuild them would be to fight not only against physical destruction, but against the idea of defeat itself. Every battleship lost or damaged became a question of identity. Could a nation that had been humiliated rise stronger? Could the very vessels that seemed obliterated be restored, not just as ships but as living symbols of resilience? The answer, though distant and daunting, would soon begin to take shape, not in celebrations but in the careful, tireless work of those who refused to accept that America's beating heart had stopped. The contrast was stark. Japan reveled in immediate triumph, basking in the fire and the smoke, while America stared at twisted hulks, silently plotting a return from the brink. What appeared lost forever would soon be reclaimed, and the world would witness a feat that would redefine the limits of engineering, determination, and national will. Beneath the water's surface, the battleship lay broken, a skeletal reminder of Pearl Harbor's fury. Its hull was ripped open, turrets twisted, and decks flooded with seawater. To the untrained eye, it was a vessel beyond hope, a ghost of steel destined to linger at the bottom of the harbor. Yet, for the men who would dare to attempt its resurrection, it represented a challenge that could define the very course of the war. Engineers, sailors, and dockworkers converged on the wreck with a mix of awe, fear, and determination. They understood the magnitude of what lay before them. The task was not merely technical. It was almost unthinkable. Raising a massive battleship, damaged by bombs, torpedoes, and fire, from the harbor floor required precision engineering, unprecedented coordination, and a relentless will to defy expectations. Every calculation mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between a restored symbol of power and a catastrophic failure. Even seasoned officers in the U.S. Navy doubted the timeline. The conventional wisdom of the era suggested months, perhaps years, would be needed to bring such a vessel back to operational readiness. Yet surrendering to delay was not an option. America's naval supremacy hung in the balance, and the Pacific theater waited for no one. If the fleet remained crippled, the Japanese advance would continue unchecked, and the psychological blow of Pearl Harbor could become a lasting wound. Suspense thickened in every shipyard, where riveters and welders moved like a human clockwork, synchronized yet improvising under immense pressure. Every deck plate lifted, every bulkhead replaced, every compartment pumped dry was a small triumph against seemingly insurmountable odds. Engineers devised ingenious solutions for flooded compartments, using compressed air and temporary patches to stabilize the ship long enough for repairs to begin. It was a ballet of intellect and brute strength, a choreography of desperation and determination. The stakes extended far beyond the steel itself. This was a battle for morale, for national pride, and for the credibility of a navy that had been humiliated in front of the world. Each day that the battleship remained submerged or out of service was a day the enemy believed they had won. The question loomed like a specter. Could America rebuild its lost giant quickly enough to reclaim not just a vessel, but its standing in the Pacific? Could a nation under siege rewrite the rules of possibility through sheer ingenuity, resolve, and teamwork? In the minds of those men, engineers hunched over plans, sailors wading through flooded decks, and dock workers swinging hammers, the answer was not a question of if, but of how fast. Every rivet, every weld, every calculated risk became part of a larger narrative, one of defiance, resilience, and the audacious human spirit that refuses to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The impossible challenge had been set, and history waited to see who would rise to meet it. Beneath the smoke-stained sky and the echoes of distant explosions, the true heroes of this story were not generals, admirals, or strategists. They were ordinary Americans, armed with nothing more than grit, skill, and an unyielding resolve. Torches hissed and sparks flew, hammers rang against steel, and welding masks shielded faces streaked with grime. Day blended into night, and night into day, as hands that refused to surrender labored tirelessly to resurrect what had been broken. These were men and women who understood the stakes in their bones. They had witnessed Pearl Harbor's destruction, felt the sting of national humiliation, and carried the weight of a country demanding action. Yet, they were not motivated by fame or glory. They were driven by something far more elemental, the refusal to accept defeat. Every rivet hammered into place, every bulkhead patched, and every engine component restored became an act of defiance, a statement that America would not remain bowed in the shadow of destruction. The energy in the shipyards was almost electric. While Japanese commanders in distant lands celebrated what they believed was a decisive victory, the American shipyards hummed with relentless activity. Men carried steel plates as though their own strength could forge victory. Engineers and laborers, often side by side, shared knowledge, improvised solutions, and pushed machines, and themselves, to limits that had once seemed impossible. In the chaos of repairs, there was a strange poetry, precise, synchronized, and unstoppable. Anger and determination became fuel more potent than coal or oil. Each worker seemed to carry a fragment of the nation's pride, hammering it, welding it, and fitting it back together piece by piece. Where the enemy saw wreckage, Americans saw possibility. Where they saw defeat, Americans saw the canvas of resurgence. It was a testament to human will, a collective refusal to let the past dictate the future, a demonstration that courage is not only found on the battlefield, but in the sweat-streaked hands of those who rebuild after catastrophe. The spectacle was almost surreal. A broken Leviathan, a ship once deemed dead, rose under the constant assault of work lights and welding sparks. While the world believed the battleship was lost forever, these hands, calloused, burnt, and relentless, proclaimed something entirely different. Every pulse of effort resonated far beyond the shipyard walls. It was a message to allies and enemies alike. America's spirit was unbroken, and the tools of ordinary men could achieve the extraordinary. This was more than reconstruction. It was resurrection. And in those shipyards, amid the sparks and the roar of machinery, the heart of the U.S. Navy began to beat once more. Beneath the water's surface, the battleship had once seemed a tomb of steel and fire, a vessel claimed by destruction. But now, amid the clatter of tools, the hiss of torches, and the roar of pumping engines, a resurrection was underway. The salvage operation was nothing short of miraculous, a symphony of engineering, courage, and relentless human determination. The first step was to wrest the ship from the harbor floor. Compartment by compartment, workers pumped out water, shoring up the hull with temporary patches to prevent further collapse. Engineers devised ingenious solutions to stabilize the massive vessel, threading air hoses into flooded chambers, sealing gaping holes, and reinforcing weakened decks. Every decision carried immense risk. One miscalculation, one ruptured bulkhead, and the battleship could sink again, consigning months of tireless labor to ruin. Cutting through mangled steel became a daily rhythm. Decks twisted and warped under the weight of bombs and torpedoes were carefully sliced and replaced. Massive cranes lifted torn sections, while welders fused new steel onto the old, bridging destruction with ingenuity. Sparks flew like fireworks against the night sky, illuminating the faces of men determined to reclaim what the enemy had taken. The operation was painstaking, exhausting, and yet mesmerizing in its scale. And then gradually, the impossible became visible. Slowly, steadily, the battleship began to rise. Like a ghost emerging from the depths, it breached the surface, its silhouette a mixture of ruin and rebirth. The water that had swallowed its decks receded, revealing the hull, battered but unbroken. The sight was surreal. Observers who had once mourned the loss now whispered in disbelief. The ship was breathing again. For Japanese pilots who had once circled above, gloating at the destruction, the news would have been inconceivable. A ship they had deemed lost forever was alive, floating once more under its own steel power. But for the men and women on the decks and in the shipyards, it was a testament to more than technical skill. It was a triumph of human spirit. They had turned despair into action, loss into restoration, and chaos into creation. As the battleship slowly righted itself, rising from its watery grave, the symbolism was undeniable. Steel that had been shattered by bombs and torpedoes now stood as a living monument to ingenuity, collaboration, and the refusal to accept defeat. The harbor, once a place of destruction, became a stage for one of the most extraordinary feats of naval engineering in history. What seemed permanently lost had returned, breathing again. A challenge to the limits of possibility, and a warning to any who might doubt the resilience of a determined people. In the smoky glow of the shipyard lights, amid the smell of burning metal and salt water, the rebirth of a battleship became more than a story of reconstruction. It became a legend, a lesson in perseverance, and a powerful reminder. Sometimes, what appears dead is simply waiting for hands brave enough to bring it back to life. Time was the enemy. Every sunrise over the harbor was a reminder that the Pacific did not pause, that Japanese forces remained active, and that the world watched in suspense. For the workers, engineers, and sailors, the reconstruction of the battleship had transformed into more than a task. It had become an obsession. Every hour, every minute, every second counted. Delay was not just a risk. It was a threat to national security. Work shifted into an unrelenting rhythm. Crews labored around the clock, rotating in shifts that blurred day and night. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the roar of pumps created a symphony of urgency. Teams coordinated with precision, breaking down enormous problems into solvable tasks. Riveters hammered at record pace, welders fused steel with a combination of skill and instinct, and engineers orchestrated repairs with meticulous timing. Nothing could be left to chance. The pressure was immense. Every broken deck plate, every twisted turret, every flooded compartment had to be addressed swiftly and correctly. A single misstep could mean days of delay, or worse, catastrophic failure. And yet the workers pressed on, driven by a shared understanding. Speed was not merely efficiency, it was survival. The faster the ship returned to service, the sooner it could defend the Pacific. The sooner it could restore the morale of a nation wounded but unbroken. Japanese commanders, watching from afar, had never imagined such a feat was possible. They had celebrated the battleship's destruction, confident that it would remain a silent wreck for years. To them, the idea of a ship rising from the harbor, fully repaired and combat-ready in months rather than years, was absurd. And yet that impossibility was precisely what America had chosen to attempt. As the days passed, the shipyard became a theater of relentless ambition. Innovations emerged under pressure, new methods to streamline repairs, creative engineering solutions to patch damaged armor, and organizational strategies that maximized every worker's potential. Deadlines became personal challenges, each team pushing to exceed the expectations of the last. The pace was grueling, but the results were undeniable. Slowly, suspense turned into amazement. The battered giant, once a lifeless mass at the harbor floor, was beginning to look like the battleship it had always been. A formidable force rising against the odds. Observers began to whisper, then cheer. Could this ship truly return to the fight before the enemy struck again? Could a vessel once deemed irreparably damaged rejoin the fleet in record time, challenging both physics and expectation? Every nail, weld, and patch was a countdown against the clock, and with each passing day, the impossible drew closer to reality. The battleship's resurrection was no longer just a repair, it was a race, a defiance of fate, and a reminder that, in the hands of determined men and women, time itself could be conquered. Thousands of miles across the Pacific, in the sleek command rooms of Japanese carriers and air bases, disbelief rippled through the ranks. Pilots who had circled the harbor, bombs released with precision, and flames observed with pride, were now confronted with reports that challenged everything they thought they knew about war. The battleship they had deemed dead, crushed, burned, and submerged, was alive again. Reconnaissance planes brought back images that seemed almost unreal. Steel hulls, patched and gleaming, rose from the waters where only wreckage had lingered. Decks once twisted beyond repair were straight and fortified. Turrets, previously riddled with fire and shrapnel, now stood ready, loaded, and operational. Commanders stared at the photographs, refusing at first to believe the evidence before them. Could a single ship, once so thoroughly destroyed, truly be restored in record time? In the minds of the pilots who had witnessed the attack, it was inconceivable. Their calculations, their strategy, their triumph, it all appeared undone. What they had considered a decisive strike, a permanent victory, now seemed incomplete. The shock was not merely technical, it was psychological. The very notion that steel, fire, and water could be overcome so quickly challenged the Japanese understanding of warfare and industrial capability. Whispers spread through command rooms like wildfire. "Impossible," muttered one officer, tracing the contours of the photographs with disbelief. How could they rebuild so fast? Another shook his head, struggling to reconcile the victory they had celebrated with the news arriving in real time. The symbol of American naval power, once believed sunk and forgotten, had returned, a ghost from the depths, challenging both expectation and pride. The speed of the reconstruction was more than remarkable. It was humiliating from the perspective of the enemy. The lessons were clear. America had resources, ingenuity, and a collective determination that no attack could permanently suppress. For pilots and strategists alike, the realization was unsettling. The ship was no longer just steel. It was a statement, a challenge, a testament to resilience that could not be ignored. By the time the battleship rejoined active patrols, the Japanese command had shifted from surprise to cautious respect. What they had witnessed was not just engineering, it was the audacity of a nation refusing to be defeated. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, a lesson was written in steel and sparks. Even the most devastating blow cannot silence those who refuse to surrender. and even the deepest wreckage can rise again, under hands willing to work beyond the imaginable. When the rebuilt battleship finally slipped into open water, it was a sight that defied expectation. From the moment its hull cut through the Pacific, sailors and officers aboard felt a sense of triumph that went far beyond personal achievement. This was no mere ship. It was a phoenix risen from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, a testament to human ingenuity, perseverance, and collective will. Every wave that lapped against its reinforced hull, every coil of smoke from its operational funnels, announced to the world that what was thought destroyed was alive and ready to fight. The return to combat was swift and purposeful. The battleship's main guns, once silenced by bombs and torpedoes, roared back to life, shelling enemy positions with precision. Carriers and transport vessels that had once faced peril without support now found themselves shielded by a steel leviathan, whose presence alone altered the tactical landscape. For the American Navy, the morale boost was immeasurable. Sailors who had endured the humiliation of Pearl Harbor now felt the pulse of confidence, pride, and renewed purpose reverberating through the fleet. The symbolism was not lost on the nation. Newspapers chronicled the ship's return with awe, and radio broadcasts carried the news of a triumph that seemed impossible just months earlier. The battleship had transformed from a wrecked relic into a living emblem of national resolve, a physical representation of a country that refused to accept defeat. Every salute, every cannon fired, every maneuver executed reinforced the message: America's spirit, like its steel, could not be crushed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japanese commanders grappled with an unsettling reality. Their victory, once celebrated with confident laughter, was unraveling. The ships they had assumed destroyed were now operational, their guns trained once more on targets that had seemed safe. Plans based on the assumption of American weakness were suddenly obsolete. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. Where there had been triumph, there was now doubt. Where there had been confidence, there was unease. The battleship became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the audacity of human endeavor. Its journey from the depths of Pearl Harbor to operational supremacy illustrated the extraordinary potential of focus, collaboration, and determination in the face of adversity. Every sailor aboard, every engineer who had touched its steel, every laborer who had toiled in shipyards, could look upon their work and know they had changed the course of history. By the time the battleship had completed its first missions, it had become clear the Phoenix had risen, and in doing so, it had rewritten the rules of expectation. Japan's laughter had been replaced by dread, and America's despair transformed into a renewed confidence that even the darkest day could yield triumph. The ship had not only returned, it had reminded the world that resilience, ingenuity, and courage could defy destruction itself. War is often measured in weapons, tactics, and technology, but it is ultimately defined by the human spirit behind them. The Japanese pilots who struck Pearl Harbor had calculated speed, precision, and surprise, believing that these factors alone could secure victory. They counted on the destruction of battleships to demoralize a nation, to cripple a fleet, and to assert dominance across the Pacific. What they failed to understand, what no reconnaissance could reveal, was the invisible engine that powered America's response: willpower. The resurrection of the battleship was not the product of machinery alone. Steel could not weld itself. Cranes could not lift without guidance. It was the hands, minds, and hearts of ordinary Americans that transformed a sunken giant into a living, battle-ready force. Every rivet hammered, every deck patched, every engine component restored was infused with determination, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that failure was not an option. Engineers worked through nights that blurred into days. Sailors and dock workers pushed beyond exhaustion. The nation's industrial machine became a chorus of relentless effort. This collective drive, this unity of purpose, was something the enemy could not predict, nor could they counter. Machines and technology, no matter how advanced, cannot replicate the ingenuity, improvisation, and sheer stubbornness of people determined to reclaim what was theirs. The battleship's return was a tangible reminder of this truth. While Japanese pilots celebrated their tactical success, they had underestimated the resilience, speed, and creativity of an adversary that refused to accept permanent defeat. The deeper lesson lies in what the enemy could not see: the invisible threads of sacrifice and collaboration that underpinned every repair. Victory in war is not simply about what is destroyed, but about what can be rebuilt, restored, and improved. The battleship, once a symbol of loss and humiliation, became a monument to human determination, a declaration that courage, coordination, and perseverance are more powerful than bombs, torpedoes, or strategic surprise. This lesson transcends the battlefield. It is a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, of how unity and relentless drive can achieve what appears impossible. The ship's resurrection demonstrated that destruction is never final when people refuse to surrender, when communities organize, and when collective effort channels energy into action. The Japanese attack had intended to silence a fleet and break a nation, but instead, it revealed a truth far more enduring. True power is measured not just by weapons, but by the will to rise from ruin. As the battleship steamed back into the Pacific, it carried with it a message for allies and enemies alike. The most formidable force is not just steel, or their strategy. It is a people united by purpose, willing to face impossibility, and determined to turn despair into triumph. What the enemy never understood was simple yet profound. Victory cannot exist without resolve, and no attack can destroy what is held together by the human spirit. The story of the rebuilt battleship is more than a tale of steel, rivets, and naval engineering. It is a lesson written in the language of resilience. What emerged from the depths of Pearl Harbor was not merely a restored vessel, but a symbol of humanity's capacity to confront destruction, harness ingenuity, and transform disaster into triumph. Every scar on its hull, every reinforced turret, every polished deck carried a narrative of struggle, collaboration, and unyielding determination. For the sailors who climbed aboard, the ship was living proof that adversity can be conquered. For the engineers and dock workers who had labored night and day, it was a testament that effort, persistence, and skill can achieve what the world deems impossible. And for a nation watching from afar, it was a beacon of hope, a demonstration that no blow, no matter how devastating, can permanently define the limits of possibility. The battleship's legacy extends beyond military history. It is a parable of resilience, a reminder that setbacks are not endings but opportunities to rise stronger. The Japanese attack had intended to humiliate, to break morale, and to assert dominance. Instead, it revealed an essential truth. The measure of strength is not in avoiding defeat, but in how decisively one recovers from it. America's ability to rebuild so quickly, efficiently, and effectively challenged conventional notions of limits, proving that determination, unity, and courage can rewrite expectations. History, like life itself, is filled with moments of devastation. Battles are lost, plans fail, and sometimes the path ahead seems insurmountable. But the rebirth of this battleship offers a universal lesson. Being knocked down is not the end. Triumph is born not from the absence of hardship, but from the willingness to rise again, faster, stronger, and wiser. Each rivet hammered back into place, each compartment restored, each engine recommissioned echoes this truth. Human will and collective effort can turn catastrophe into opportunity. Even decades later, the battleship stands in the annals of naval history as a monument to perseverance. Scholars, military strategists, and engineers study its reconstruction as an extraordinary feat of planning, innovation, and courage. Yet the most profound lesson is not technical. It is human. It speaks to anyone who faces obstacles, setbacks, or seemingly insurmountable challenges. It whispers that failure is not final, that destruction can give birth to strength, and that the human spirit, when united and determined, can transform impossibility into reality. As the rebuilt giant steamed into history, it carried more than guns and armor. It carried a message that transcends war, steel, and strategy. In life, as in battle, true victory is measured not by the blows we endure, but by the speed, strength, and courage with which we rise afterward. The battleship of Pearl Harbor reminds us all that resilience is the ultimate weapon, and that no force, no matter how overwhelming, can defeat those who refuse to surrender.